Welcome to Nerdy on Hangouts, and now we're in the season of Lent, and as appropriate for this time, we're going to be talking about the resurrection tonight. And guest is Steve Kindle, and he's written a book called "You're Right, I'm Wrong," and we'll probably thrash on that a little bit tonight. But what I really want to get into right away is the resurrection. My view is the resurrection is the most important doctrine in the Bible. I take that from 1 Corinthians 15. And so I want to start off with just a simple question of how do you view the resurrection, and how is it important for your understanding of Christianity?
Well, thank you, Elgin. I think we need to put the subtitle of my book out there, too. It's not just I'm right and you're wrong. It's why we disagree about the Bible and what to do about it. But regarding your question, the resurrection is a very important part of my faith. It is what gives me hope as a human being. It grounds me in my faith. And I find that the more I learn about what I believe the resurrection is all about, the greater my understanding of God becomes, and also the church's place in the world. So I definitely believe in the resurrection. We may disagree as to some of the particulars about this, but it is absolutely an essential part of my faith.
Well, we're starting off on a clear note of agreement. So you mentioned that we might disagree on some of the particulars. Like I said, I'm a fairly conservative evangelical. I believe in, as I was mentioned earlier, Google Hangouts. I do believe in inerrancy, although I don't usually talk. I don't push that as something I really debate. I talk more about reliability when I talk to non-Christians and people who don't accept inerrancy. But given, and I don't really want to get off on inerrancy, but given my that's sort of my stake into the ground as to where I stand. How would you differ from someone who's, I think you described as more liberal in your view? How do you differ from a conservative evangelical, someone who doesn't really understand the liberal perspective?
Well, I'm not sure I understand it all that well myself, but the big difference in this regard would be not so much, okay, I don't believe in inerrancy, but that doesn't mean that my understanding of the place of the Bible as my source authority is diminished at all. What some people would call contradictions, I call differences in points of view. And so we have throughout the Bible what I consider to be differences in point of view being worked out amongst the people involved. And they will contradict each other as to specifics, but the point isn't the contradiction. The point is really, why do they come at it from a different perspective? And so when we're going to be talking about the resurrection, I'm going to be coming at it from a perspective that would be very different from an inerrantist, for instance. One of the things that I don't quite understand from the inerrantist point of view is how they can accept the biblical worldview of a three-tiered universe. And that particular worldview, which is outdated, it's unscientific, it can't be supported, but it's throughout, it begins in Genesis 1 and it goes all through the New Testament, that there is heaven above, there's the earth in between, and the underworld below. And much of the language that's used in resurrection depends on that picture. So I would reject that worldview, and accordingly, I look for other explanations as to what we're talking about when we talk about things like the resurrection or the ascension or the virgin birth or what have you.
Okay. Well, I don't think there's any evangelical out there who believes that if we dig deep enough into the earth that we will come across hell. Your narrative would argue that.
Well,
Yeah,
they don't say that. They say it's beneath the earth, not underneath, not in the ground somewhere.
and
Like heaven is above it, so the underworld is below the earth, not in it.
yeah, and I would not take those as necessarily literal statements. I wouldn't say they're necessarily wrong, but I don't see them as literal. Whenever we talk about heaven, heaven is oftentimes, and even God is put into anthropomorphic terms.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I don't believe that those terms are to be taken literal. That it's trying to describe God and or heaven and or hell in a fashion that we could understand, and therefore I wouldn't see any problem with those from an inerrantist point of view. But let's go back to the resurrection. And so, where would you disagree, or and I wrote, is there any fundamental disagreement with you would have with a conservative's view of the resurrection? And I'm not necessarily talking about how many angels were at the tomb or things like that, but in terms of its centrality to the faith and its importance to us as Christians. Is that a place that from your perspective that conservatives and evangelicals could all be in agreement on, or is there some difference there in application that I'm not seeing?
Well, I don't think so. As long as we don't have to depend upon agreement as to what we mean by resurrection. But certainly resurrection, as I mentioned in the beginning, is very central to Christianity. It's central to my faith. And I think it's essential to a proper theological outlook.
When you say we have to agree on it, do you mean, like, for example, do you believe that Jesus rose bodily from the dead?
No, I don't.
Okay. How, in what sense does the resurrection mean then?
Well, if you say bodily, like Lazarus, I mean, Lazarus was bodily raised from the dead, but then he died, we're assuming. So if it's bodily in that sense, I don't think you or I would go there. Bodily is an elusive term. It can't be pinned down in the scriptures. I mean, you've got Jesus eating and probably drinking, I mean, and taking a meal with the disciples in his resurrected state. And then he's apparently walking through walls as well. This body is an elusive notion of just, we can't pin down, really, what we're talking about. So I reject the notion that the body was anything like Lazarus, as in other words, a reconstituted human form brought back to life. So when you reject that, then you're open to a variety of possibilities, none of which are in the realm of physical.
Okay. Interesting. So, I mean, even evangelical Christians would argue that there was a difference between Lazarus and Jesus in the resurrection, that Jesus had a resurrected body, a body that shares some characteristics with ours, but is yet to be defined. It's something that we don't fully understand what that is, for exactly some of the reasons that you stated. So I think it wouldn't be difficult to find. I'm not sure we disagree yet. So I guess what I'm coming to.
Well, I think
I'm still struggling to find a disagreement here.
I think I can help you though figure that out, because where these appearances, and I put that in quotation marks, happened, the literal reading and I think the wooden reading of those scriptures suggests that someone who looked like they had an actual real body appeared before them. And I don't think that's what is at stake here. It wasn't something that looked like a real body. It was something entirely different, based on 1 Corinthians 15 and the appearances themselves and Paul's understanding of what he saw, which was not a real body. So I think this is where we might see things differently.
So was the tomb empty?
Probably not.
So you would reject the whole concept of the empty tomb then, that the body that Jesus died is still wherever the remains are, still wherever it was laid to rest? Or does the central you can look at the accounts of the resurrection, and if you focus on the appearances. In fact, actually, in terms of one of the things I talk about in my book, is the two main arguments for the resurrection are the one that he was seen by so many people, and that two, that the tomb was empty. And you can come up with plausible theories for one or the other, but the only thing that fits both of them is the resurrection. It's one of the reasons we can be so confident that the resurrection occurred. So it seems like you're tossing out the empty tomb. Am I correct in that, or am I misreading something?
No, I think it needs more explanation. Most evangelicals, and I don't know if you fit this category or not, but most evangelicals take what's called a synchronic approach to the literature of the New Testament. Synchronic means basically that it is one thing. It's the New Testament, and it's treated as though it fell from heaven in that form. And because it's a completed set of books that is now the canon, it can be interpreted in its entirety in any one spot. For instance, when you read 1 Corinthians 15, for instance, or any of the resurrection statements that come from the period after Jesus' death, not in the Gospels, but in the epistles, in the earlier writings, most evangelicals take what they understand from the Gospels and import it into those passages. I think that's anachronistic, and it's doing damage to those passages, because as exegetes have been able to show, 1 Corinthians 15, they didn't know an empty tomb. They didn't know these appearance stories as we understand them from the Gospels. So my approach is diachronic, and what that means is we look at the development of the text as it came to be, and notice as time goes on how things are added, supplemented, and changed at the very end, or the outcome of the New Testament, which is basically the Gospels. So the empty tomb did not start out as a part of the story. It went from a general belief in resurrection, which you get from Daniel chapter 12, which I take to be a 2nd century document, 2nd century BCE. 2nd Maccabees and 2nd Esdras, contemporary with the New Testament, talk about a general resurrection. And that's because after 5 empires tyrannically destroying them, putting the heel of their boot on their necks. And especially with the martyrdom of Second Maccabees, the question arose, God obviously isn't going to be doing anything about this. So what is going on? And the answer came, well, God is going to vindicate all of the good people in the resurrection and destroy all the bad people in the resurrection. So the resurrection became a means of hope for Israel that followed its way into the life of Jesus and the apostles and the early church as a way of explaining how Jesus' crucifixion fit into that model of despair, which can only be overcome by an act of God in the resurrection. So I see a development here that displays features added to it as time goes on.
Okay. Well, that at least helps me understand a little bit more where you're coming from. I obviously would, as you say, disagree. For example, I don't believe the Gospels came last. Actually, I think very likely the first written account in the New Testament was probably the Gospel of Matthew, and that was in existence before Paul even wrote his first letter. So I would think it was also in existence in 1 Corinthians 15.
Let me interrupt you there.
Sure.
So, why do you take that point of view about Matthew when the overwhelming preponderance of scholarship says that isn't right? Is it because it helps you with your theory?
Actually, no, not at all.
Okay.
I basically, having looked at that particular issue, I think the reason most scholars accept the priority of Matthew is simply because it was sort of settled back in the 19th century, and it has not really been that seriously challenged. And most people, I mean, you know, I agree, even most conservative scholars will still accept that. I find it very difficult to believe, having looked at my evaluation of the evidence. And my point wasn't so much that I'm right or you're wrong, to steal the the title of your book, but the fact that so much of the theory that of a development is based on an awful lot of assumptions. For example, I believe Matthew was written first, Luke was written second, and that Mark was written third based on the sermons of Peter. And I think Peter gave those sermons because when Luke wrote his gospel, I mean, I take Luke, the ending of Acts, to be, he ends there because that's where Paul was, and he brought it up to current time. So I would lock in Acts in the early 60s. I think Luke was written during Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea, and that the publishing of Luke was very problematic because of the issue of, you know, is this a second gospel? Is this a new gospel? Is this a, you know, other than Matthew, which Matthew was already in existence? And so I think publication of that was withheld, and when they went to Rome, Peter gave a series of sermons, and it's as if he is scrolling through, you know, you can, as it's been described, there's two scrolls there, Matthew and Luke, and he starts preaching from the Gospel of Matthew, and the corresponding scribe is kind of keeping the place with Luke, and then every so often he switches between them, which would explain why the individual periscopes, individual accounts inside of Mark tend to be longer. It's as if he's expounding and giving some of his personal experiences and adding some of his eyewitness accounts. to the Gospels as he's preaching through them, which will also account why they start when they do, and it would also account as to why the Gospel of Mark ends when it does. Forgetting aside, for the sake of argument here, the differences in the ending of Mark, but roughly it ends where the two Gospels diverge. So Mark begins at the place where the two Gospels come together for the first time, and metaphorically stitches them together, going back and forth, never moving backwards as it moves through the story. So one of the big things for me is the idea that Matthew and Luke were written independently based on a previous existing Gospel of Mark. I find difficult to believe, because it would have required a level of coordination so that each one could pick the spots to give this stitching together effect that the Gospel of Mark actually does, which also explains, for example, why it appears between the two, because of that particular reason. So there's a lot more evidence there, and but it's not just because, oh, that makes my theories a lot easier. It's because there's actually a lot of thought and understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. I happen to think I'm right, and I think scholarship over time will probably crack that open, and people will come back and look at it. But
you may be right. You may be right.
A lot of the theory that we have this nice development depends an awful lot on a lot of assumptions. That I think that's where probably evangelicals and the more liberal minded, progressive minded really separate. It's not so much on the text itself, but it's on the assumptions that we bring to the text.
I agree with that, and I find your reiteration of your point of view to have a solid scholarly background, and it is a point of view that is out there. There's no question about it. I just don't follow that particular point of view. But I want to ask you this. If Mark ended by telling the women that they're to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, and then they told nobody, how does that move into knowing what Matthew and Luke said about them telling everybody?
Well, I think it was that the particular event at that point in time is, I think, what he's describing. He's describing his particular interaction with them.
To tell nobody. I mean, to tell the disciples, and then they didn't tell a soul. But in the other Gospels, they told a lot of people.
Eventually, yes. Yeah. But that's where the accounts diverge, and I think you get it's an issue of scope and perspective, and what's actually being described, as opposed is it focusing on a narrow event, which I think is what Peter was doing at that point in time, as opposed to giving the broader picture, which is what happened over a large period of time.
Okay.
So going back to the resurrection in terms of, so if it's not I'm trying to avoid the term bodily, but it's not a resurrected body as, say, an evangelical would accept, what is the resurrection then? What does it? Is it a symbolic thing, or what is the resurrection for you?
Well, let's attack that from another angle, and let's look at the ascension, for instance. Now, when I'm talking about a three-tiered universe, the ascension only works in that universe where Jesus lifts off the earth and goes through the atmosphere, and then 250 miles above the earth in their cosmology is heaven. Mm-hmm. That's understandable. Okay. I can't imagine that I'm supposed to take that as literal. As a matter of fact, if Jesus, go ahead.
If Jesus, I wouldn't take it literally in that sense either.
Okay, so if Jesus took off in 30 AD, at the speed of sound, he'd still be traveling. Now, that is just incomprehensible to me on the literal level. On the metaphorical level, however, it makes perfect sense that this is how they would describe how uh, he was exalted to the right hand of God. Another metaphor, of course, the right hand. So what we're dealing with here is metaphor. We're trying to describe virtually the indescribable, which is, where does Jesus fit into the scheme of things with God? And the answer is that through the metaphor, we see Jesus as proclaimed by the church as being God's spokesperson to humanity. Now, the resurrection and the ascension are tied together. They're
Mm-hmm.
both metaphorical. The resurrection, all the appearances, and if you look at the language, it can easily mean appearances, not actual events that you could put a video camera on and then rewind and look at it and see the same thing reiterated again. But rather you have uh, appearances, um, phenomenon that can't be nailed down, put in a test tube, and verified. Something that's very common when people who are close to people pass away. They often come back in visions of one kind or another. Even my grandmother thought that she saw my grandfather out in the garden one day, where they used to be together a lot, and claimed to have had a conversation with him. I don't take that literally, um, but that's what people do in situations like this.
Why wouldn't you take
So
it literally?
go ahead.
Why wouldn't you take it literally?
Why wouldn't I take what literally?
That her husband came back and talked to her.
Because it's a clinical phenomenon that has been explored to death, as it were. And their conclusion is that this is the way the mind works. It has nothing to do with anything outside the mind. I accept that.
Okay, and I don't disaccept it. I don't.
Excuse me, I
I
want to
don't
interrupt you guys so that I can do introductions. While we're laughing about that, let me do a couple of introductions.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm Henry Neufeld. I'm the owner of an Ergion, and I publish both of these guys. Well, one book, and we're working on another one for Steve. Our guest tonight is Reverend Steve Kindle. We've just released his book, I'm Right and You're Wrong, Why We Disagree About the Bible and What to Do About It. And I do agree we do need to have the subtitle of that particular one in order to get a clear idea of what he's talking about. And of course, we are talking about something on which our two authors disagree about the Bible. I'm editing on Steve Kindle's book, Stewardship, God's Way of Recreating the World. And it is going to be a very interesting short book. Both of these are in our Topical Line Drive series. Elgin Hushbeck is also the author of several Energeon books. I'm going to mention three, which is his Evidence for the Bible, which deals a great deal with precisely what we're talking about, Christianity and Secularism. Its companion volume in the Consider Christianity series, and more recently the Topical Line Drive, What is Wrong with Social Justice? And we will definitely not start discussing that latter book today, so that we have time to talk about the resurrection. I was hoping you don't mind my introducing a question into the discussion here. I really have two. I'll introduce one now and maybe interrupt you with the other one later if I see the time. But would it be possible for you each to you've been talking about the dating of the sources, but for viewers, kind of list what are the especially the New Testament sources that you depend on for the resurrection, and about when would you date them? I mean, you've both referred to 1 Corinthians 13 and, of course, the resurrection stories in the Gospel, but, not a comprehensive list, just kind of a brief idea of how you see this, because I can tell that you look at your sources very differently. I don't know who wants to start that first.
Well, let me start by saying first off on Steve's book. I've read that book, and although we disagree quite a bit on a lot of the particulars here, that's a book that I think spans the spectrum. It was a wonderful book. I enjoyed it very much, and it's something that a liberal or a conservative across the spectrum could read. And like I said, I agreed with almost everything he said in that book, even if I disagree with everything he's saying here. But so that was actually a wonderful book, and I would highly, I would highly recommend that. I'll start on the dating.
Let me say about your evidences book.
What's that?
Let me say something about your evidences book. By the way, are you going to put a second volume out?
There is a second volume.
Oh, there is.
Christianity and Secularism.
Oh, okay. I have read a lot of these Christian evidences books, and mostly it's a rehash of things that have been done, over the last 100 years. You brought some very interesting new notions to it that I found very worthwhile to have read the book. Having been a fundamentalist in a previous life, and I don't mean in reincarnation, but I lived off these books and grown away from that point of view, as obviously you see. But I was not expecting some of the freshness that you brought to that book, and I would encourage people who think that they know all the evidences to take a look at what you've done, because they'll find some good stuff there, that's for sure.
Well, thank you. I was an atheist in a previous incarnation, not literally, but earlier in my life, so that was probably one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did. Is I've been blessed or cursed one way or the other to have not grown up within institutions and have basically struggled to come to my own views, and so sometimes they end up being different, like accepting the dating of Matthew as first. So getting back to that, I would date Matthew, not really sure, anywhere from the mid-30s to the 40s, the late 40s. I'm not exactly sure where in there it was written, but my guess would be somewhere in that time. I think there's some allusions between Matthew 24 and Thessalonians, such that I think that Paul had at least read Matthew before that. The Luke, of course, I would date into the late 50s, Acts into the early 60s, Mark shortly after that, probably the early to mid 60s, and then John I would date probably in the late 80s or early 90s.
Okay. Where would 1 Corinthians be in that?
I believe that's in the mid 50s.
No. I'm just trying to get a picture.
I'm not real up to date on the dating of Corinthians, so I would have to go back and refresh my memory on that, but I believe it's somewhere in the mid-50s.
Okay. I would start out with the earliest books. Everybody seems to think 1 Thessalonians falls in that category. 1 Corinthians, roughly the late 40s, 50 Common Era. Then the Gospels come along, 65 to 70 for Mark, Matthew 85, 80 to 85, Luke about the same time, John 90s somewhere. I'd even accept a second century date for it. And if you use that chronology, something very interesting happens in 1 Corinthians 15. Because in that passage, let me get to it. Paul is recounting what he's received. This is church tradition. Need to get my glasses on here. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Okay, what Scriptures are we talking about? Well, probably we're talking about the Old Testament. And what I find fascinating about that Scripture is that it was because of the Scriptures that they came to the realization of the resurrection, even on the third day. So that the notion that the Scriptures taught this preceded the actual recording of the events. And having a date of around 50 Common Era for that book makes that 30 years, probably 25, 30 years ahead of any of the Gospels. And it's very primitive, it's very lean, and it's dependent upon the Old Testament right at the start, nothing else.
Okay. Yeah, since I believe Matthew was in existence at that time, although interestingly, even though it's according to the Scriptures, I don't think that would, even though I believe Matthew was in existence, I don't think that would necessarily include Matthew. So I read that it was a fulfillment of prophecy, and Matthew would have been a statement of what happened as opposed to a fulfillment of prophecy. I also have an issue. One of the things that troubles me is going to, say, for example, any letter like Philippians, Corinthians, or any other letter, any other New Testament, particularly the letters when they're dealing with very topical instances, and saying, well, it doesn't mention this, therefore it wasn't known, or it wasn't known about at the time. As someone who writes, there's lots of things that I know that I don't put into my books. I don't necessarily include anything, and so something was not mentioned by a writer, for me, I find it very problematic that to conclude, well, if they didn't mention it, therefore they didn't know about it. Like 1 Corinthians doesn't mention the empty tomb, therefore Paul didn't know about the empty tomb. I find that whole line of reasoning suspect.
Yeah, and the reason why I would say I don't write anything I don't know. That's why my books are so small. Yeah, I hear your point there, and that would be an argument from silence, I think, on both sides. Nobody really knows. I think there's perfectly good reasons for making assumptions about things like this, especially since in Philippians, when you've got that keynotic description of Jesus emptying himself and going through that process, there's no resurrection there. It just goes from death to exaltation, And so why would they skip that particular thing, which seems to be a hallmark of the Gospels, but it doesn't seem to come up anywhere in the listing of events as they occurred in the epistles?
Well, I would say in Philippians, it's to show. I mean, to me, the purpose of Philippians is unity, and it's one of those little questions I'm interested when I get to heaven is, what was going on with Yodi and Syntyche that was causing such a split in that church, that he ended up having to write a letter, which to me structurally is all about unity and how we need to be able to be unified and to submit. So for him to in this whole overview of unity and submission, to talk about how Jesus emptied himself and then was exalted, I'm not troubled at all by the fact that the resurrection doesn't occur in that, because the purpose of writing that was to show how far he submitted himself and then what his ultimate exaltation was. And the process in between is really not that important to the overall theme of the writing. Could have put it in, could have left it out. Not, I think you could make arguments either way on that one.
Well, except for the fact that the scholarship on that is that was a received text. That was a hymn that preceded Paul, and he used it for his purposes of establishing the humility necessary to be a follower of Christ, as following his example. And because of that, earlier than Paul even, we don't have a resurrection in the narrative.
Yeah, and even I'm familiar with the arguments, and even if it's accepted that as you'd have to argue that's the entire. I mean, if it was received, it's probably an excerpt from a much larger piece, and then we'd be speculating about what's in the, again, what ended up on the editing room floor for what Paul adapted to fit his particular means there.
I think that's a lot of
What's it?
I think that's a lot of conjuring yourself there.
Well, you have to make assumptions one way or the other, and I'm not even convinced that Paul didn't write that hymn for that particular.
Okay.
That letter, sure. But it would be like going through the Psalms and picking out individual verses in the Psalms and saying, well, because this only mentions this here, therefore the rest of it wasn't known. That's the part that troubles me. But let me go to a question that I'm sure that some of my more evangelical brothers and sisters are wondering about, because we had this talk about the bodily resurrection. I know one of the key verses that's often brought up on that is Thomas. So how does Thomas fit into your understanding of the resurrection?
Well, I wish you'd be a little more specific.
Well, Thomas didn't believe in the bodily resurrection. He didn't believe. Yeah. He thought it might be a ghost or something that had appeared, and he ended up having to stick his hands into.
Oh, that Thomas. I thought you meant the Gospel of Thomas. I'm sorry. Oh. I was going in a.
No, I'm evangelical. I'm not going to be bringing up the Gospel of Thomas.
Okay. I thought, boy, this is really interesting. So start over, please.
So how does the account in Luke, I think it's in Luke, about Thomas doubting, where he gets his name, the doubting Thomas, and wanting to stick his finger into the nail holes to see that really was Jesus and not just an image or a ghost. How does that fit into your understanding of the resurrection?
Well, this is where your friends are going to be very disappointed in me, because I don't take much of anything from the Gospel of John to be historical. I think that much of what is written there was written not by eyewitnesses. It wasn't written by John, in my view, for sure, John the Apostle. But by way of analogy, let me bring in Adam and Eve, and we'll get to doubting Thomas in a second. I don't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. Evolution, in my view, is a reality, and you have to factor that into the biblical story. One of the reasons why the creation scientists would argue that the earth is 10,000 years old is because the Bible picks up the story of humanity about the time of the 10,000 BC when civilizations started happening. And the stories around how civilizations formed, the farmers against the cities, and on and on, are all reflected in the early stories of Genesis. So, but what do I do with Adam and Eve? Well, I believe the truth of the Adam and Eve story, which is what? That human beings are born into the world in basically a naive state, a state of innocence, and at some point we will choose against God. We will want to become our own gods, and then life, if you'll forgive the expression, goes to hell from there. So, and then God, as the story moves on, does what is necessary in order to bring the world back to its senses. Okay, so no, I don't take Adam and Eve literally, but I believe the story of Adam and Eve. Now, as far as the doubting Thomas is concerned, I think it was made up out of whole cloth. But it was made up for a purpose. And the purpose isn't that Thomas found his faith by sticking his hand into the wounds, but so that people who won't have that opportunity, such as you and I, can have faith nevertheless, which is a much better conclusion to that story in my view.
Okay. Well, I obviously believe John wrote John.
I'm shocked.
I figured you would be. Actually, I think John. To me, the key, or the key to the Gospel of John is the last verse, where it talks about so many books could be written that would fill the entire world. To me, I see that verse, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I see that verse as John, at the end of his life or near the end of his life, saw the other Gospels and realized there was just so much more that he knew, and as the last apostle, that he would, once he was gone, it would be gone with him. And so he set about to write a gospel that included information not in the other Gospels, which is why it's so different. There's a few places where it obviously has to deal with the same things, but for the most part, it's a completely different view of the gospel. And so I see its difference is not that it's a completely different stream, but it's that it's just he's writing from different accounts.
Okay.
I also believe the gospel, the First John was written by the author of John, and I find it difficult to, from my perspective, to give any credence to First John, since it's stressed so highly on eyewitness that it's difficult for me to take it seriously if it's not accurate. So that would be my view on John. I don't see any reason. I guess one of the big differences for me is I approach the books of the Bible with they are what they are, and I give them the benefit of the doubt until shown otherwise. And so I'm, for example, I think there's pretty good evidence that James was probably the earliest book written in the 40s. It was shown through scholarship that it wasn't. Wouldn't damage my faith one bit. Wouldn't probably go quite as far as Luther and toss it out, but so a lot of these things for me are very evidence-based, but I think I end up giving the benefit of the doubt to the book. I would make one other comment that, and maybe you don't hold this view or not, but I find a lot of the more liberal people I talk to, particularly atheists, confuse the doctrine of inerrancy with the doctrine of literalism, that everything must be literally understood, and that I reject. Thus, for example, one of my favorite example of that is when Jesus was asked if we should forgive somebody 7 times. He said not 7 times, but 77 times. Right? I don't believe that at 78 we're free to condemn. So
yeah. So I don't make that mistake. Yeah.
So I believe that inerrancy to me is that the Bible is to be understood that it's correct in whatever the author intended to say, and um, frankly, that clears up most of the objections. Now, I do believe that some things are metaphorical. I believe in the ascension was a metaphorical. The resurrected body, I don't think was completely metaphorical because of the doubting Thomas incident. So I'm not. I'm in a sense constrained that I can't drop off pieces of the New Testament just because they don't fit what I believe, and therefore I'm gonna throw them overboard and say, well, they're just later creations to justify some sort of theory. I guess I'm burdened with having to try and understand it for what it is, not for what I would like it to be. And that's not meant to be a criticism of you, but I'm just saying, to me, whenever we approach the Bible, as someone who teaches the Bible, my biggest concern as a teacher is that I not put myself into what I'm teaching. That I work hard trying not to do that. And I think for me, for example, you should have no other gods before me, and you should not take the Lord's name in vain. I think those two commandments are basically saying that we have to make sure God is number one, and number two, that we should the one of the Ten Commandment that cannot be forgiven is that we carry the Lord's name in vain. That we I believe that is to take our beliefs and put upon them the metaphor of God. When we say the Bible says, when we're really saying I believe.
Okay.
I think that's the Ten Commandment, the one of the only Ten Commandment that cannot be forgiven.
Well, let me tell you my problem with inerrancy. It's that for inerrancy to have any value, you have to have inerrant interpreters, and there aren't any. We can only approach perfection when it comes to interpreting. And until we arrive at that state, we're basically just fumbling around, trying our best to figure out what's going on. And with inerrancy, the assumption is that what I'm reading is true. That's the assumption. Yeah, okay, but how is it true? Is it true because God said it? Yes. Is it true because I understand it the way God meant it? Probably not.
And that's something I would agree with. I believe the Bible is inerrant. I don't believe in inerrant interpreters. I don't believe I'm one.
Can I interrupt you guys again?
Sure.
This is an audience question in the sense that I'm part of your audience. Okay. I want to get both. I want to get both of your editor and publisher gets to call himself part of the audience if he wants to. We've talked about 1 Corinthians 15 a bit, and we only have a few minutes left here. I really wanted to hear some comment on actually the passages in the 40s, but in particular, let me just quote 44, where it's sown as a physical body, but it's raised as a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual one. That's 1 Corinthians 15:44. How does this physical and spiritual bodies fit into your view of the resurrection?
Well, I believe that's always clearly not a problem for me, because I believe we are both fully, we are spirit and we are physical, and that both parts are important. Thus, for example, I know, for example, some of the new research on mental processes claims that they can account for everything that people do because of brain technology. So they can see that when you're angry, it highlights this part of the brain, or when you're you're mad or sad, it highlights that part of the brain, or when you feel pain, it highlights a different part of the brain. And since they can track all this down to the various parts of the brain, that just shows that we're completely physical beings. I have a problem with that because that's, to me, that's the metaphor, to use a metaphor, would be if you have a computer, right? If you break your speaker, then the sound's not going to play on a video. But that doesn't mean that the speaker is what's creating the sound. I would argue it's sort of like our body is like the computer, and our mind is like our spirit is like the software that runs on the computer. That both are involved. So I see Paul saying that both are important, are actually key to the resurrection. In the resurrection, we will have a physical body of some sort. It will be a resurrected body. It won't be exactly like our own. I hope I get something better than what I've got now. But I also believe I have a spirit, and that spirit is something that lives beyond the body. And in the resurrection, those two will be reunited.
Well, interestingly enough, I have a little different take on that. When it says sown, let me quote it exactly. I'm going to have to. It is sown a physical body. It is raised a spiritual body. Sown a physical body. That's what you start with. Then it's gone when the spiritual body is raised. I don't see that they necessarily continue contiguous with each other. Which again suggests that that was Jesus' body. It wasn't physical. It was sown physical because that's what you're born into, but raised differently. And that's why these are appearances rather than actualities. That help you there, Henry?
Yep, I just wanted to get the comment on that because I was almost certain that you would have approximately the difference that you did, and I want to make sure that people who are listening and thinking about the resurrection know to read not just 1 Corinthians 15, the first few verses, but well on through the chapter talks about the view of the resurrection, and to see that. And also, just let me give you the time warning. You have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to want to announce the next event at the end.
Okay. Well, do you have any final thoughts or any summations that you would like to, anything that you wanted to say that we haven't had a chance to say yet?
Well, I tell you, you've been pretty thorough. All the notes that I took in anticipation of what might happen seem to be exhausted by our conversation. And I appreciated your directness and your ability to take what I had to say and respond to it appropriately. And I felt like we've had a good conversation, and we have also exemplified what I hoped to be able to do in my book, which is one of the things that you were saying earlier. We can leave, hopefully, understanding each other better and appreciating each other's discipleship better. So in conclusion then, I'll kind of restate what I said in the beginning, which is the resurrection for me is God's vindication of the crucifixion of Jesus by the principalities and the powers as represented by the Roman Empire, and that they won't have the last word in our world, but the last word will come from God when the world is restored to God's original intention. How, I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I have faith that it will happen, and that shalom will ultimately prevail. And for me, that's the meaning of resurrection.
Well, great. I'll just quickly say that that I think there is, even though we have vast disagreements, I think there's a a core of agreement, and I think it's important that we realize that even though we may differ on details, that we still serve the same Lord, and that's what we should be keeping most in mind. So, Henry, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, I want to mention that, and I didn't keep my notes on all the times, but next Tuesday night we're going to have Lent, Season of Forgiveness. I will be interviewing, and my guests will be author Renee Crosby, who wrote Soup Kitchen for the Soul, and most recently her novel The Fringe. And I'll also have my wife, Jody Neufeld, who has written a couple of books, including Daily Devotions of Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. The two of them will be joining me to talk about forgiveness in Lent and how it applies especially to spiritual healing. We're coming up in the week of the 23rd on Consider Christianity Week, which is one of Elgin's projects. We will be having 4 additional Hangouts that one week, starting on the Monday night with Confidence. Consider Christianity Week, it'll be Confidence. Then we'll have a regular Tuesday night event. On Wednesday night, we're going to talk about unity. On the Friday night, we'll be talking about outreach. And our guests on the Friday night, I'm not sure, Elgin, whether you're going to be there for that one.
I think I will be.
You will be? Okay. The other 2 guests are Pastor D. Kevin Brown from North Carolina. He's a Southern Baptist pastor, and Reverend Shauna Hyde, who will have just released her book, Vicar of Tent Town, or rather it will be in the process of going to the printer. And they will be talking with me about outreach. And then on Saturday, we're going to have an in-place interview with Chris Serber, who's also an Energeon author and is currently serving in Haiti. He's going to be talking about serving there. So we're going to get very practical with those last 2. And one last thing, even though it's not part of this series, I do a study on the book of John right now on According to John on Thursday nights on my own YouTube channel, and I want to bring that up. I'll put a link to it on our energeon.com news blog because it's related. Author Dr. Harold Weiss, who wrote the book Meditations on According to John, will be my guest on Thursday night, and I think I'm going to pretty definitely ask him about Thomas and putting his finger in in Jesus' side and in the nail prints in his hands, and see what he has to say about that.
I'll be watching.
I have a lot of questions stacked up for Dr. Weiss, and he is quite an expert on this. He's retired after a teaching career that ended at the St. Mary's College at Notre Dame, and has written quite a number of books. But in any case, I'll be talking to him on Thursday night, and that question at least, and there's a couple of others that came up that I might add to the list, but right now I don't think I'll get all my questions in an hour. So, in terms of announcements, I ran 3 minutes over time. Everybody have a good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. And thank you, Elgin and Steve.